In 1951, the United States led a group of countries in signing a treaty with Japan, the San Francisco Treaty. But three words need to go in front of that. The so-called San Francisco Treaty. Why add those words? Because it was illegal. It was just a worthless piece of paper. Today, let's break down where this scrap paper came from. On January 1st, 1942, as World War II kept expanding, and the fascist powers, Germany, Japan, and Italy, grew more aggressive, the four major allies, China, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, along with more than 20 other countries, issued the Declaration by United Nations. The declaration had 2 points. First, every country had to give it everything it had and fight the fascists to the end. Second, no one could make a separate peace with them or sign a separate treaty. Simple and straightforward. In a life-or-death war, unity was essential. From then on, nobody could hold back. Everyone had to go all in, and the war began to turn around. In less than 2 years, Italy surrendered. Defeating Germany and Japan became only a matter of time. The major allies figured it was time to settle what would happen after victory. In November 1943, China, the United States, and Britain issued the Cairo Declaration, requiring Japan to return the territories it had stolen from China, Manchuria, Taiwan, and the Penghu Islands. At the time, Manchuria was under Japan's puppet state of Manchukuo. Taiwan and Penghu had been taken after the First Sino-Japanese War. And remember, Taiwan here included the Diaoyu Islands. Of course, Japan could still hold out for a while back then, and refused to accept the Cairo Declaration. Less than 2 years later, Germany also surrendered. Japan was the only one still stubbornly holding on, so the major allies gave Japan an ultimatum. In July 1945, China, the United States, and Britain issued the Potsdam Declaration. The Soviet Union later joined it. It demanded Japan's unconditional surrender, along with the elimination of militarism and the dismantling of military industries. The most important part was Article 8. It required that the terms of the Cairo Declaration be carried out. That included returning Manchuria, Taiwan, and Penghu to China. And there was more. Japan's sovereignty would be limited to Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, and Shikoku, its original 4 main islands, plus any smaller islands determined by the Allies. In other words, Japan had to give back all the territory it had seized in modern times. But Japan was militarist at the time. Even when defeat was obvious, it still refused to surrender. It was preparing to throw the entire population into battle, in a so-called honorable death plan. The U.S. saw how stubborn Japan was, and knew a full invasion would be costly. So it thought, well, we just made 2 atomic bombs. Let's test them out. The Soviet Union also formally declared war on Japan, thinking it could follow the Germany playbook. Everyone takes Japan down together and splits up influence afterward. But unexpectedly, just a few days after that declaration, Japan surrendered. So in the end, only the United States occupied Japan. Japan surrendered, unconditionally. Japan's instrument of surrender clearly promised full compliance with the Potsdam Declaration. Let's repeat what that meant. Manchuria, Taiwan, and Penghu were to be returned to China. Japan's sovereignty was limited to its 4 original main islands, and other small islands determined by the Allies. World War II ended, and the Cold War began right after. The U.S. and the Soviet Union started competing. Each big brother led a group of allies, facing off against each other. Let's not even get into Europe, where NATO and the Warsaw Pact were evenly matched. In Asia, the U.S. was getting anxious. Why? Because its local allies were not exactly useful. Chiang Kai-shek, who had been on America's side, was left with just 1 island. The whole Chinese mainland was flying red flags. And on the Korean peninsula, the southern side controlled by the U.S. was weak militarily. The Western Pacific did not look promising either. The U.S. urgently needed a new junior partner in the region to hold the line. So the U.S. looked at Japan, which it had just beaten down, and said, "You'll do." Sure, they had fought a brutal war against each other, but there weren't many other options. It had to be Japan. After all, Japan was under U.S. control at the time. But if the U.S. wanted to rebuild Japan, there was one problem. Japan was a defeated fascist state. It was still being reformed, only halfway through. And because Japan had devastated so many countries, issues like post-war compensation still had to be settled. In other words, Japan needed to sign a peace treaty with the Allies to legally end the state of war. Only after these issues were sorted out could Japan return to normal and get back on its feet. In 1951, the United States invited more than 40 countries to San Francisco to sign a treaty with Japan. That was the so-called San Francisco Treaty. More than 40 countries may sound like a lot, but many of them had almost nothing to do with Japan, not even remotely. The most outrageous part was that China wasn't there. Yes, you heard that right. They signed a treaty with Japan without inviting China. China had fought Japan the longest. China had suffered the most under Japan. The Chinese people made enormous sacrifices. and contributed so much. Yet, when it came time to sign a treaty with Japan, China was excluded. Isn't that just gangster behavior? As for this kind of gangster treaty, the People's Republic of China has never recognized it. The Soviet Union was invited, but it firmly opposed the treaty's contents and refused to sign. Remember what the anti-fascist alliance had agreed to. In the declaration by United Nations, no separate armistice or treaty with the fascist states. Of the four major allies that led the declaration, one was excluded and one refused to sign. So this was just a worthless piece of paper. China was not allowed to participate, and the Soviet Union firmly opposed it. You don't need to think too hard to know something shady was going on. So let's look at what was written on this scrap paper. The treaty said, the state of war between the Allies and Japan was over. The military occupation of Japan was over. Japan's war reparations were reduced or waived. Japan could develop normally again. But the most shameless part was this. Japan renounced sovereignty over Taiwan, Penghu, and several other islands. See that? The Cairo Declaration and Potsdam Declaration had said Taiwan and Penghu were to be returned to China. Other small islands would be determined by the Allies. Now it was changed to Japan simply renouncing them. Oh, what a clever little trick. Once you say renounced, there's a lot of room to play games. Because of this, some separatists have shamelessly claimed that Taiwan's status is still undetermined. And then there's Ryukyu. After Japan renounced it, it fell into American hands. 20 years later, the U.S. handed it back to Japan. Technically, it only transferred administrative control, not sovereignty. But Japan renamed Ryukyu as its Okinawa prefecture. Remember, Ryukyu was originally an independent country, just like Korea. A defeated country somehow expanded its territory. Who are you supposed to complain to? After Japan signed this lousy treaty, it was thrilled. Its Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida was beyond excited. He called it an unprecedentedly generous treaty. With this thing, Japan got back on its feet. Nobody cared much about demilitarizing Japan anymore. Then the Korean War broke out. The U.S. was fighting in Korea and used Japan as a logistics base. Japanese military industries started running at full speed again. Of course, the U.S. wasn't stupid. It knew controlling Japan required troops. Didn't the military occupation just end? The U.S. immediately signed the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty with Japan. That was only 5 hours after the other treaty. Japan would provide military bases, and the U.S. could station troops there long-term, under the name of protecting Japan. Of course, if anything happened in the region, Japan had to step up too. The U.S. wasn't raising it for free. Within a few years, the U.S. let Japan rebuild its military. But it had to change the name. After all, Japan was supposedly demilitarized. So from then on, it was called the Self-Defense Forces. Japan was very obedient. It did whatever it was told. As the logistics base for the Korean War, and with support from the world's leading superpower, its economy recovered quickly. China, under the leadership of the Communist Party, also stood tall again and set out on a new path. Its influence kept growing. It gained more and more friends. And in 1971, it returned to the United Nations. The People's Republic of China became China's sole legitimate representative at the UN. China and Japan are close neighbors. After more than 20 years, remaining neither at war nor at peace was not normal. So the two sides talked and figured life had to move on. In 1972, China and Japan issued a joint statement. From then on, the two sides had normal state-to-state relations. This is what people often call the normalization of China-Japan relations. That joint statement dealt with major principles and was very important. Both sides officially recognized it. The statement said Japan deeply reflected on the harm it had caused the Chinese people through war. For the sake of friendship between the two countries, China also waived reparations. Several other points were also important. Japan recognized the government of the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China. Taiwan is an inalienable part of the territory of the People's Republic of China. On this position, the Japanese government expressed full understanding and respect, and pledged to adhere to Article 8 of the Potsdam Declaration. What did Article 8 of the Potsdam Declaration say again? It required the terms of the Cairo Declaration to be carried out. That means Manchuria, Taiwan, and Penghu were to be returned to China. Japan's sovereignty was limited to Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, Shikoku, and other small islands determined by the Allies. See that? It's written in black and white. Japan signed and recognized it. Now let's go through it one last time. In 1942, the World Anti-Fascist Alliance was formed. China, the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union led the declaration by United Nations, which prohibited separate armistices or treaties with fascist states. In 1943, China, the U.S., and Britain issued the Cairo Declaration, requiring Japan to return Manchuria, Taiwan, and Penghu to China. In 1945, Article 8 of the Potsdam Declaration by China, the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union required the Cairo Declaration to be implemented. Japan could keep only its original 4 main islands, with other small islands to be determined by the Allies. That same year, Japan surrendered unconditionally and fully accepted the Potsdam Declaration. In 1951, the U.S. led the signing of the so-called San Francisco Treaty with Japan. China did not participate. The Soviet Union did not sign. It violated the declaration by United Nations. So it was illegal, invalid, and nothing but scrap paper. But because of that scrap paper, Japan got Ryukyu back, contested the Northern Islands with Russia, fought South Korea over Dokdo, and fought China over the Diaoyu Islands. It even wants to challenge China over the Taiwan issue. In 1972, China and Japan normalized relations and issued a joint statement. Japan recognized the government of the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China. Taiwan is an inalienable part of the territory of the People's Republic of China. Japan also reaffirmed Article 8 of the Potsdam Declaration. Manchuria, Taiwan, and Penghu returned to China. Japan only keeps sovereignty over its original 4 main islands, with other small islands determined by the Allies. Is it clear now?